Hi everyone, David Sod here from Skyjems.ca. Thank you all so much for joining me. It is an honor and a pleasure to have Mr. Warren Boyd here from Potentate Mining. He's absolutely one of the most highly regarded field gemologists and geologists in the country. He's worked on mines on 6 different continents, and it's really, knows more than just about anybody I know in the business. Super lucky. I've known him since I was a little kid. He's a friend of the family, and I have him here for you. So, Warren, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, David. That's a very kind introduction. And yeah, when you said I'd worked on 6 continents, I actually had to check that out to make sure you were correct. And pretty close. I haven't been to Antarctica yet, but I'm not in a rush.
So, Warren, today we're going to be talking about Potentate and specifically Rock Creek Sapphires. Just going to have some questions for you and go from there. First question I want to ask is, can you give our viewers a brief history of sapphires in the Rock Creek area and how they were first discovered?
Well, that's an interesting question. Montana sapphires are not new, and they're not new on the market. The deposits in Montana were actually discovered in the late 1800s. In this particular area, the project we're working on, owned by Potentate Mining, was discovered in 1892. I think I tracked down the first newspaper article, and prospector Brian was out looking for gold, and came across these shiny little pebbles, which he kept in a jar for his grandchildren. And according to the newspaper article, he took them to Jeweler Wayland. I don't know who that is, but Jeweler Wayland back in 1892, 93, and Jeweler Wayland identified them as sapphires. So that was the first recorded occurrence of sapphires at Rock Creek near PHILIPSBURG, Montana. And by 1902, they were at in Jewellery at the Paris Exposition. So they were very much known by the industry in the early 1900s. So the really serious mining happened between 1905 and 1935. The sapphires were mined primarily because there was a large volume of sapphires there. And they were mined, well, there was gems, they were recovering the gems, but the bulk of the sapphires were being used in the Swiss watch industry. And the client for the shipment at that time were the Goebel and Jeweler in Switzerland, who in turn was selling them to the Swiss watch industry. And that's well documented history.
That's absolutely fascinating. So, fast forward a bit and, if you can tell us a little bit about how Potentate first began operations in PHILIPSBURG, Montana, and how have things been growing over the years?
That time after 1935, well, synthetics came on the market. The Swiss watch industry didn't want natural sapphires for the jewel movements. They started using synthetics in the watches. And during the war years, things went quiet there. They weren't mining the sapphires anymore. And then mostly it was small-scale artisanal operators who were working in the area in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then in the 1980s, 1990s, the technology for heat treatment became widely known. And they developed recipes for heat treating sapphires. So this particular deposit, which had an abundance of sapphire, but the bulk of them require heat treatment to improve the appearance. And what does it do to improve the appearance? So I can get into that later. But the new technology came along in the 80s and 90s. And I was on the project as a geological consultant in the 1990s, and that's my first introduction to the project. My partner, Dr. Keith Barron, involved in this, he was also on the project in the 1990s, so he and I were both familiar with it and said, wow, what a fantastic project. But that company didn't progress. It was mostly a promotional company at the time in the 1990s. But we didn't lose interest in it. And then the project...
Sorry, may I interrupt? When you say a promotional company, how do you mean?
Oh, it was a public company, and they were using it as a promotional entity to raise money, and they weren't really serious about marketing the product. And so my involvement at the time was writing due diligence reports for an independent mining engineering firm, not working for the company, but as an independent consultant. Similarly, Keith was in the area because he was working on an industrial garnet deposit some miles away from this deposit and was familiar with the Sapphire deposit. But the project was tied up as private property. A forestry company owned it at this time from the mid-90s till mid-2000s. And the man owning the private property by this time passed away, a lumber company. And we purchased the assets from the estate of the lumber company. So from mid-90s till 2000s, about 20 miles of roads were put in over the project, and all the trees were removed by the forestry company, so suddenly it was accessible. And the previous ground was inaccessible before the 1990s because it was Bureau of Land Management or state property, so you're not allowed to mine it. And so when it became private property, that meant you could mine it. You could apply for a small miner's exclusion permit. So when we acquired it, we were the first ones with the cash and acquired the project in 2014, and put first production out late 2015 and selling by 2016.
Well, it's fantastic. I mean, it's really great material that you are pulling out of there and that we're getting to enjoy. Now, something that this was, when you first told me about this part here, I had to have you explain it to me, I think 3 times, because it just kind of bent my brain a little bit. And that is about the mine's, particular mountaintop location where it is. Can you tell us what it is about that makes it unique?
Yes, it is a very unique occurrence. I think God was generous on this area because, first of all, one of the big problems with mining in this area, in fact, in North America, especially the north part of North America, is glaciation. The diamond mines in Canada, for instance, there's no weathered bedrock sitting on the surface. You have glacial tills, and the glaciers effectively scrape down all of the weathered bedrock and spread it to the winds, so to speak. This particular area of the mountains in Montana, for some reason, the glaciers never touched it. So it's an untouched by glaciation, even though there's glacial valleys to the north and to the south. This particular hilltop was untouched. Which meant that the bedrock was deeply weathered and not scraped away down to the hard bedrock by glaciation. The geology is the sapphires were probably emplaced or arrived in the Eocene, which was, I think, 50, 60 million years ago. I better check the dates there, but in the Eocene geological epoch. And they were intruded much like volcanoes. The sapphires came from deep beneath the earth up to the surface in what geologists call alkali basalts. A more specific term might be lampropheres or laproites. And they're a very unusual type of geological occurrence. All sapphire deposits in the world, there's only 1 or 2 that I'm aware of that occur in lamprophytic or alkali basalts. The basalts you're seeing that carry the sapphires in Australia are quite different. The Shandong sapphire occurrences are flow basalts, big, thick flow basalts that flow out on the surface. Similarly, you're seeing the same in Thailand. And in Sri Lanka, you have a different type of geology altogether, high-grade metamorphic rocks. Similarly, in Greenland for the ruby occurrences, high-grade metamorphic rocks. So the geology is unique, and it's reflected in the appearance and the look of the sapphires. The shapes of the sapphires are quite different as well. So
they definitely have a very, very unique color to them. I only have a few stones from you right now, and I actually have them on a turntable here. But I know that in looking at them and spending time with them, the life in the gems is definitely quite unique. Something that I don't know of any other sapphire that gives you the same kind of, both glow and a silkiness, and yeah, there's almost a little bit of modeling that you can see from really close up, but then from just a little bit further you get that really interesting blend of the color.
The sapphires are quite unique at Rock Creek in the fact that the crystals are blocky, short, stubby crystals. Some are tabular, but by and large, the bulk of them are a nice uniform, blocky shape. If you close your fist, they're that's sort of the shape of your fist, sort of blocky, chunky crystals. Unlike sapphires you see out of Sri Lanka, which are, well, some people call them barrel-shaped or dog-tooth shaped because they're long. So consequently, the advantage of those crystals is the cutters like them because they get relatively high yields. The stone is almost preformed, ready for them, and all they have to do is shape it. So the buyers like it because they get relatively high yields on the cutting. Also, one of the things you've alluded to there, the appearance of them, is they're bright and clean. For some reason, nature has been kind, and the fact that the stones that are natural without silk are bright and relatively clean. They're beautiful. They reflect all the light that comes out of them if they're cut properly. The ones that have a little silk in them, as soon as you heat them, that silk dissolves within the stone and turns the stones into very clean. So I would say of the production we're getting with heating and natural, about 75 to 80% of the stones we recover are cuttable quality.
Oh, really? 75 to 80%, but that's
mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you don't see that in many deposits around the world. Well, I can't cite any specifics because I don't have the statistics on them, but many of the sapphires you recover from most mining operations are fairly opaque. They're really a industrial grade, and then occasionally you'll get the gemmy material. But in this particular deposit, for reasons that are not really clear, you get a very high percentage of them with clarity. Even the large crystals have chunks of them that are clean, so you can cut a bunch of little stones out of them. Whereas some deposits from elsewhere in the world, the stones are quite opaque, and you don't get much gem at all. Like when I was a boy, I collected sapphire crystals from near Madoc, Ontario, from an industrial corundum deposit that they mined for industrial purposes there. And those crystals were technically, they're sapphires. They were blue, pale blue, beautiful crystals, but no clarity to them.
Which is, I mean, that's the whole point of gems being gems, right? Is that they are that tiny little sliver at the very top of, the qualities, and then there's all the other grades. But, everything gem, that's why it's a gem, right?
Well, truly the definition of a gem is beauty, durability, and rarity. And so corundum is common, but corundum that you can cut into a gem, either that be a ruby or a sapphire, is rare. And hopefully those stones will be beautiful, therefore it's a gem, hence the 3 points.
Actually, I wanted to ask you as well. So it's something that, again, you were showing me when we got to, get together in person. You're telling me about some of the other things that you're finding during the mining process.
Well, yes, we do get a lot of garnets, but the garnets are generally not gem quality. And so for the generations of artisanal workers on the mine site, anything red they would throw away. Well, I decided that let's give a little attention to these garnets and get a closer look at them. And I noticed that some of the garnets were fluorescent. And I also noticed that some of the garnets didn't jump to the magnet like they should have. Garnets from this particular deposit are weakly magnetic. So if you take a neodymium magnet to them, they'll jump, or they'll move, they'll wiggle around on the table. And so you can pull them out. And then some of them didn't have that. We saw non-magnetic and weakly fluorescent. So we decided to do a little identification on that, and turned out that we were actually getting some rubies. So we were the first ones to actually identify and recover rubies from this deposit. So now it sounds exciting, but they're commercially insignificant. We've only, out of literally millions and millions of carats of sapphires we've mined over the last few years. We've only recovered at 11 that I would call are rubies, and the largest cut stone we got out of it was only 42 points. So exceedingly rare and truly a unique American ruby.
That's fantastic. That's really fantastic.
Another thing we have, which is I wouldn't say it's a curse, it's a blessing, is the fact that because the bedrock here is so deeply weathered, we have a very fine amount of gold occurring in our gravels. The old-time miners didn't know how to recover it because it was so fine, so they would just wash it away, but we decided to put in a recovery circuit in our mining operation. And now on average, we get between $7 and $10 for every yard of dirt we process in gold. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're processing 60 yards a day for 6 months a year, it adds up. It covers all our fuel and trucking costs for moving stuff around. And so we're getting gold as a byproduct of our sapphire mining.
Well, that's the kind of byproduct you want.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That's a heck of a lot nicer to deal with than just about anything else you're gonna be getting out. I mean, even in the garnets, if the garnets were like a heck of a lot nicer, it's like, well, I'll still take the gold and that easy money, and like you said, cover gas and whatnot. So something I want to talk about, and some people who are watching this, that are very into, American sapphire and whatnot already know, but can you please enlighten myself and the viewing audience? What is it that makes Montana's Rock Creek sapphires different from other sapphires, for example, Kashmiri or Australian?
Because of the nature of the geology and the trace element contents of the sapphire, in general, the Rock Creek sapphires have a very unique color tone. And what many people have come to call it is teal, a teal color tone. Now, what does the word teal mean? Teal is actually a duck that is quite common in Europe and North America. And when that duck flies through the air, it has these beautiful blue-green feathers. It flashes on its wings and on the crown of its head, on the temple of its head. And that's where the color term teal comes from, is this blue-green in the feathers of the blue wing or green wing teals. And but teal is a blue, green, or pastel or greenish blue tone that is very common in the Montana sapphire, specifically from Rock Creek. Very rarely do we get the deep color tones that you might see in the best of the Kashmir or the best of the Sri Lankan stones. That's quite unusual from our deposit. We do get it, but it's very unusual.
Next questions, we're talking about the colors. There's the term American blue. So what is American blue, and is this a common color that is found at Rock Creek?
Yes, I would say a synonymous term for the colors I just alluded to, the teals, would be American blue. And I've come to call it that. I haven't really heard it so much beforehand, but I wouldn't say I coined the term, but it is a very typical color that you see in Montana, that any experienced stone dealer trading in stones can see the difference between a parcel of Montana sapphires versus a parcel of Australian versus a parcel of Sri Lankan or East African or Nigerian. They have a very unique tone or saturation to them. And so I just came to call it American blue because it's simpler than trying to explain what teal means.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I know teal stones obviously we know it's they've really taken off, and there's some debate of whether Montana sapphires grew in popularity, which made teal stones grow in popularity, or teal stones were growing in popularity, which made Montana stones grow in popularity. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
yeah, I would tend to go for the latter. I think Montana in some ways has created the popularism of teal. And the reason I say that is I have a stone dealer I deal with in Israel, actually, that I do a lot of business with, and that I've known for 30, 40 years. And when I first showed him some of the material we were recovering, he said, well, that color will never sell, Warren. You won't be able to sell that. Now he's a regular client because he's had so many people asking for the teal tones. So that's an evolution I've seen in a period of 5 or 6 years. So I tend to think it might be because of the popularization of the stones, the promotion of it. There is some material coming out of Nigeria that has a tone, a teal tone, but it doesn't quite have that American blue look, the brightness, the intensity of the clarity that you're seeing in the American blues.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. Nigeria, there's some Ethiopian material that looks, that has, it's, bluish green, greenish blue, and it's beautiful material. But it doesn't have, it's like you said, it doesn't have the brightness and the fire to it that, you get out of the American stones.
I should mention also, David, there's a lot of other colors that come from our deposit. We're getting peach and oranges. We're getting yellows. We're getting colorless sapphires as well. I've talked about the rubies. Those are by far the rarest, but oranges, yellows, peach tones.
Are you getting like orange peach, peach orange?
Some, the locals, and we've come to call them Rocky Mountain Padparash because they're quite rare when we do get them. Some heat treat, some natural, but by and large, the ones, most of the ones we've produced so far would be heat treated. I've seen a few and we processed and cut a few that were natural. Today's consumers are quite savvy. They have their own ideas of what they like and what they don't like. It's reflecting an evolution in fashion, an evolution in tastes, and an evolution in what's considered acceptable. Like the unusual pastel colors in Rock Creek Sapphires are ones that at the time that these were mined in the early part of this century, the sapphires were either blue or they were worthless. In the early 1900s, if they weren't blue, they were worthless.
And that goes for even pinks and yellows?
Yeah, you just don't see them. I mean, there's a quotation from Frederick Kunz, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but that I had researched, where he had said regarding Rock Creek Sapphires that never have he seen such a range of colors as he has in Rock Creek in Sapphires. So that's a quotation back from, I think it was 1910. I'll find the exact reference. I don't have it in front of me, but I had cited it in one of my previous talks. And for those who don't know, Dr. Frederick Kunz was the man they named Kunzite after.
Yeah, actually, one of my, everybody's favorite gemologist, the first gemologist or whatever. Did he actually ever, did Frederick Kunz ever go to Rock Creek himself? Or
I don't think so, no. I believe that these stones arrived in the markets in England and Paris at the time. And they arrived in Washington. It's probably the Smithsonian. I'm not quite sure where he saw them, but it was probably in the eastern United States. I'm not aware that he ever visited the mine. We have had the curator and the associate curator of the Smithsonian visit the mine already, though.
Yeah, I mean, I know anybody anybody who I ever meet that says they're really into gems, I'm like, yeah, you really need to go to the Smithsonian and lose a day there. Whoever you're in Washington with, just tell them to come back and meet you in the same room in a few hours, and to have them be at your mine and be excited to be picking your sapphires is a lot of fun.
Well, on that topic, in 2018, we recovered what turned out to be North America's largest gem sapphire, a 64 karat crystal that we named it the Ponderosa Sapphire. And through some negotiations of that, it's now in the possession of the Smithsonian, and it's going to be part of their display sometime in the next year or two.
You have that on loan to them?
No, they own it outright now. They own it outright. It's they may rename it, but we called it the Ponderosa Sapphire, and the press we have on it is the Ponderosa Sapphire. And I coined that term because the largest pine trees that we have on our property are called ponderosa pines. It also, for those older people, generates the feel of the Ponderosa Ranch and the Bonanza series on TV. So I thought it sort of raises the spectra of ponderosa pines and cowboys. So, and that's what Montana's all about.
So we've already covered some of the colors. So can you tell us a little bit? What can you tell us a little bit of the size? What are the average sizes that you're seeing in the gems mined in Rock Creek?
By far, the largest proportion of what we produce are smaller stones, but this is not unusual for any mining operation, whether it's diamond mining, sapphire mining, emerald mining. You'll find that the number of large stones is very small. The number of smaller stones is higher, and Rock Creek is no exception. The largest volume of sapphires we produce would cut gemstones in the range of 20 points to a carat, carat and a half, and the balance of what we produce, probably less than 5-6%, would produce stones more than a carat and a half and polished. So, so the largest volume of Rock Creek sapphires you'll see on the markets are between 10 to 15 points up to carat, carat and a half.
So anything over a carat and a half is really getting into the point where, you know, you're talking about a very, very rare gem.
Yes, it's quite uncommon. Like I do very detailed size distribution analysis on our rough, and the material that cuts 2 carat and up represents about 1 to 2% of our production. And even though it may cut stones that size, because the larger crystals generally have natural fractures in them or whatever, the larger crystals don't necessarily cut larger gems.
Now, you were talking a little bit about the hocus pocus, flux filling and glass filling and whatnot. Have you done, or do you have anybody who's done any kind of experiments with that, with any of the stones from Rock Creek, just to, I mean, even if it's not to market it, just for, you know, just for fun, see if you can flux, you know, if you can flux treat it or whatever.
Actually, our material, you have to have material that improves on appearance by getting flux infilling. Really, what flux infilling does is it takes a material that has full of cracks or surface reaching fractures and fills those up with a glass with a very close refractive index, but not quite the same as sapphire. We don't need to do that on any of our sapphire. It's a really tight stones with no surface reaching fractures. If there's fractures in the stone right now, our cutters are working around the fractures, or if there's inclusions in the stone, they're either leaving them in there or we're heat treating them, and so that the silk or rutile dissolves. So no, none of our material that I'm aware of has been flux infilled. There is a treatment called diffusion that some people are doing on sapphires. That's not an uncommon treatment to see on sapphires in today's market. And most of the diffusion using the element called beryllium, it's called deep diffusion. It diffuses beryllium through the entire stone. It changes the appearance of our stones radically, but it also cheapens them. It turns them into very, very inexpensive material on the markets. So we have made a conscious brand protective decision not to sell our sapphires to areas where they're doing beryllium diffusion. And because we don't want the brand for our Rock Creek sapphires or Montana sapphires adversely affected by inordinate supplies of beryllium diffused or titanium diffused sapphires coming on the market.
If the gems are either beryllium or titanium diffused, is it still fairly easy to do an origin on that gem? Like if you would send, just to say if we were to take one of these stones that I have on the turntable, send it to, get it beryllium diffused of whatever color, send it off to GIA. Would they be able to do a origin certificate on it, or would that process change it so much that it would be unrecognizable?
Well, these are more of an academic question from my point of view. First of all, if the laboratory determines it's beryllium diffused, it's cheap. Therefore, there's no point having origin on it. So beryllium diffusion excludes the need for origin because origin tends to improve or reduce the value of I wouldn't say reduce, but improve the value of a stone. Like for instance, a classical Burmese ruby is worth a lot more than a Mozambique ruby of comparable color and quality, only because of origin. We're educating the laboratories around the world by providing them samples of all our materials, so they have reference collections that come directly, if you'll forgive the pun, straight from the horse's mouth from our mining operation, uncorrupted samples. So they have control samples for analysis purposes, so that when stones are coming in for certification, they have a set of controls that they can compare them against. FTIR is a method for picking out Rock Creek, Montana sapphires. We're challenged right now in the fact that many of the laboratories don't distinguish which mine it's from in Montana. They might say it's Montana, but they won't say it's this mine, that mine, or another mine. Thankfully, 91, I know from historical production figures that are well documented by the state of Montana, 91% of all sapphires produced in Montana historically have come from Rock Creek. So you have a 91% chance that if it's a Montana sapphire, it's Rock Creek. Yeah, those numbers are available through Richard Berg, a Montana government geologist who's documented the historical production of sapphires. And I did the analysis on his numbers, and it turns out that 91% of the historical production was from Rock Creek.
So, Warren, can you tell us a bit about the treatment process for the Rock Creek, Montana sapphires?
Sure. First of all, I should put things into perspective. Of our production, about 8% of our production does not require heat treatment. And of the material that's very clean, has no silk in it, has a nice natural color to it that we set aside for cutting into no heat sapphires or selling to clients as a premium price at no heat sapphires. The balance of the material has most of our crystals down the C-axis. There's often a little bit of silk in the core down the C-axis. So you can cut the stones with that silk in it, but the stones tend to look a little foggy. And some people like that, others don't. The trade tends to prefer a stone that's bright and clean, as you alluded to before, what you like. And it's nice, bright, so that the stone doesn't look like it's dirty and you need to try to clean it all the time. And so of those stones that are heat treated, there's a process involved. And the technology is not rocket science. It's just high temperature ovens that use oxidizing and reducing atmospheres. And much like baking a cake, the people who know the recipes and produce the best cake also have the ones who have figured out the right recipe to heat treat the Rock Creek sapphires. They don't share with you the details. But I can tell you, to put things into perspective, that it's a triple burn process. In other words, when they take the first heat treating, they put it up to a certain temperature in oxidizing atmosphere, and then let it cool down, look at it, and saying, oh, okay, so this one we should push it more this direction for color, so we'll put it into reducing atmosphere. This one we should push it further with an oxidizing atmosphere, so then some of the sapphires go to oxidizing in the second burn, some of them go to reducing. And then after those 3 burns, allow the stones to cool down, and then you have the nice finished stone that improves the color the most.
So I know when we were together last, water came up, and you said that you opened up a new plant in 2019, and you were explaining to me that, again, right, not being on mine sites, take things for granted. Can you explain to us exactly how important water is in the mining process and what you've done with that.
Yes, good question, David. If we didn't have water, we wouldn't be able to process our gravels because the gravel processing technique requires water. What we do is we run the muddy gravels over what's called a jig, and the jig pulsates and separates and washes off the murky water, the muddy water, and also the lightweight material floats off with the flow of the water over the jig. And what's left behind is the sapphires and any other heavy minerals are concentrated in the jig. But you need water for that process to happen. And we're at the top of the mountain. Our new processing plant is at the top of the mountain. And we have some water in the spring, occasional showers during the summer, but there's not a lot of water up there on the top of the mountain. And this was the reason that the old-time miners never mined up there, because they had no pumps. So what we do is we keep the water and we recycle it. And we put in what's called a water clarifier. A water clarifier is something about the size of a school bus, but taller. It's about 30 foot tall, about the same length as a school bus. And the many hundreds or thousands of liters of water go into that thing muddy, and the water comes out clean. It looks like drinking water when it comes out. And then we use that clean water to recycle it back into the jig for processing. And I'll explain why you can't use muddy water to wash, because if you're using muddy water, the density of the water is different. And if there's too much mud in it, it starts to carry your sapphires away. So it's very important that you have clean water absent of mud, so that your density of water is acceptable for the processing circuit. Now, I'm not aware that any other miners in the past have recycled their water. To our knowledge, we're the only sapphire miners in the world that actually recycle 80 to 90% of our water. It's just twofold. It's beneficial to us because of the shortage of water on the top of the mountain. And secondly, it means wastewater is not entering the environment. So we're not making the creeks muddy, and we're not making Rock Creek, which flows near us. Rock Creek is a famous blue ribbon trout stream. Fly fishermen come from all over North America to fish. We drive by them every day as we go to work. We see the fly fishermen in Rock Creek fishing. If we put mud into that creek, we'd be a very nasty neighbor to them. So it's important to us. First of all, that's why we stay at the top of the hill. Secondly, we recycle all our water, and we capture any muddy water or wastewater and let it settle. And then any ground we disturb at the top of the mountain, we also rehabilitate. So water is very critical to processing for sapphires.
So that's really amazing. So you kind of have a set amount of water, and you just recycling that over and over again.
That's true. We do use some makeup water. In the summer months when it's hot and dry there, we use some wells that give us some makeup water. We have a little creek that dribbles into the catchment basin, and we capture the water there. So that's enough for us to use for makeup water.
That's really impressive. Now, is there any risk of like chemical contamination during this process of, either, like you said, Rock Creek, or the surrounding area?
Well, the wonderful thing about our processing circuit is we're only using water. And we do use a material called a flocculant in our water clarifier, which is a benign organic product. It's not a chemical per se. And what it does is it takes the suspended clay and forces it to drop out. If you've ever seen those water tests come to your home and persuade you that you need a water filter because they put a little drop of something in a sample of water, and all of a sudden your water clouds and there's a bunch of sediment in the bottom of your drinking water coming out of your tap, and now you're convinced your water's polluted. Well, all they're really doing is putting a drop of flocculant in the water that causes the suspended minerals in that water to precipitate out. And that's exactly what we're doing, but we're not trying to sell water filters. We're not using any chemicals. We don't use any mercury to recover our gold. We don't use any chemicals to recover our sapphires. So therefore, none is getting into the environment.
So there's zero risk.
Zero risk. We're using hydrofluoric and hydrochloric acids to clean the sapphires, but we send them down to Butte, Montana, which is an hour and a half drive. We use a professional laboratory in Butte. And Butte is a big mining town in Montana, and there's laboratories there that acid clean our stones using these caustic acids with fume hoods and proper protection. Those are the only acids or chemicals used in our processing, and they're done in a laboratory under controlled conditions.
Well, that's fantastic. Now, while we're on this, this kick here and talking about the sustainability of the mine itself and just really how clean and responsible it is, can you tell us a little bit about how Potentate is encouraging land rehabilitation in the area?
Oh, by all means. First of all, anybody mining in Montana has to apply for and receive what's called a small miners exclusion permit. And even though we may own over 3,000 acres of private land, we're not allowed to disturb 3,000 acres of land. The only thing the small miners exclusion permit allows us to disturb is no more than 5 acres at a time. And because this is a fairly a prodigious deposit, it's quite easy for us to do that. First of all, we only strip mine on the surface, so we're digging down to no more than about 15 feet of the weathered bedrock, and we're washing that weathered bedrock and recovering the sapphires from it. And then any waste rock from our processing circuit is plowed back onto the areas we've disturbed, and then we put the topsoil back on top of that, and the slash, we seed it. So we never have more than 5 acres of disturbed ground at any given time. And anything we do disturb, as we progress during the summer, we rehabilitate the ground we worked on earlier in the season. So, so I would say that's very responsible, considering when we arrived on the property, the evidence of the damage done by the old timers was very evident. Also, when we arrived, we got 2,600 acres of land that was formerly owned by a forestry company, and every tree of any decent size was cut down on that. So we arrived with 2,500 acres stripped of trees, which is a lot more damage than what we're doing on our little mining operation. No more than 5 acres.
So you're really kind of, by the time you're done with a bit of land there, once there's a bit of time passed, it's kind of like rewinding the clock, 120 or 130 years to, before any mining was happening at all.
Yes, I mean, the forest generates quite well. The area that had been mined by the miners back in the 1910 to 1935 is now full of trees that are 100 feet, 50 to 100 feet high. It's reforested in that time frame. But at the time, they didn't do any rehabilitation. They just slashed it out, washed it out, and left these big piles of rocks everywhere. And because that's the way they did it at the time. And it was accepted. It was using what's called hydraulic mining, big, like fire hoses, shooting water up on the hills, and you get these high energy slurries coming down, and you try to catch the sapphires with primitive sluice boxes. We don't, and they had no settling ponds, no water clarifiers, nothing. So that ended up in the valley. In fact, gold miners in San Francisco silted up San Francisco Bay from hydraulically mining for gold upriver from San Francisco Bay. So hydraulic mining is now banned in North America. No one does it, and you would never get a permit to do it because it's so damaging to the environment. So how we mine our sapphires is much more responsible than the way it was done previously. We have seen in some other gem mining operations around the world where these policies are not in place about rehabilitation, mining permits, and some of the devastation it's done on the environment in areas that are not controlled by this. So we're lucky in Montana that there is a department that encourages us, and we're very responsible. We have to be in today's market.
This is going to sound like almost an odd question, especially for a lot of my viewers, because they know that I do have, Rock Creek Sapphires, but just because you did allude earlier on that some people want just the crystals. So, normally we think of sapphires, or at least, I think of sapphires as, cut gems like what I have on the turntable here. But, and these are incredible quality stones. The 2.5 carat oval is, I've spent, I don't even know how many hours looking at it. But what I did want to ask is kind of rewind that. You talked about the crystals. So how many, how much of your material do you think is actually getting cut and polished like these gems, as opposed to how much is being sold just as, as crystals that'll go into jewelry as crystals, or, just being sold as crystals to collectors?
Well, that might be a little difficult question for me to answer because the bulk of what we sell as potentate is rough. Most of my clients are people who are buying rough. And in that rough, they get all sorts of qualities of material, some suitable for nice crystals, others for cutting and polishing. But I can tell from my clients who shared with me that probably about 10 to 15% of what they sell as natural crystals to jewelry designers. The balance they cut and polish into faceted stones or cabochon cut stones. So, and that's just a rule of thumb. I don't have any hard numbers to back that up with, but based on the trade shows I've been doing, that's about right. I think I got my booth expenses covered by selling flat crystals for jewelry designers in Tucson, and the balance of the sales were rough to other exhibitors and who were cutting in Thailand, India, and Sri Lanka. So I have cutters cutting in America. I've got cutters cutting in China, cutters cutting in Sri Lanka, India. All of these markets are pretty much closed down right now. So that comes back to that earlier question about COVID. So I would say that it's reduced the volume of our sales a bit, but not much. It's going to recover quickly.
I just have one last question, and that is that there's a 2016 article by GIA, and you note that potentate is selectively is selective in forming its relationships. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And you alluded to it a little bit, but tell us a little bit about what you look for in building relationships with your clients.
Interesting question about the selection of the clients. First of all, most of our clients are rough clients, as I mentioned earlier. I've also mentioned earlier that we're reluctant to sell material to people who will diffusion treat or do any flux treating of our sapphires, just because we didn't want it to adversely affect the brand for our material. I learned from the experience of a previous miner that produced some sapphires from an operation in Africa, and because the buyers, the stone buyers at the time, didn't know how to heat treat it. All they simply did is they tossed it in an oven with beryllium. So 99% of the material that came from that mining operation was beryllium diffused. And therefore the market in this particular area decided that the material was cheap, worthless. And so it's only good for beryllium diffusion. So when I saw that kind of reaction on some of our test samples we were showing to the market, I said, okay, I don't want Rock Creek Sapphires or Montana Sapphires adversely affected by wholesale distribution of beryllium diffused, deep diffused material coming on the market. So yes, I'm selective in making sure that any of the clients who are likely to do that are not our clients. So I can't control what my clients do with a rough, but I can control whether they have a second opportunity to purchase.
Well, I mean, you can't control what they do with it after they bought it, but you can control who you sell to. Thank you so much, Warren, for joining me and enlightening me and my viewers to the incredible Rock Creek Sapphires and telling us a lot more about them.
David, thank you very kindly for this opportunity. It's been an honor passing on some of the hard-won knowledge I've had on Rock Creek and the educating people on it, because there is it's really important that people understand that we have a world-class resource here in North America that is just as good as some of the best sapphire resources elsewhere in the world. So it's been an honor being able to share some of my knowledge with you and your clients. Thank you.
To the viewers who've stuck with us through this entire interview, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me. I do have Rock Creek Sapphires available on the website, www.skyjems.ca. So come on over, join me, and take a look at some of the beautiful Rock Creek, Montana sapphires that I have available for sale. Thank you all so much for watching. Have yourself a great day, and don't forget to tell your friends about skyjems.ca. Bye for now.